You're listening to Economic Autopsy, where we follow the money through history.
Every week, we open the books on the financial crimes and collapses that shaped our world. Today's case, the Bolivian mountain that produced $2 trillion in silver, funded Europe's wars for 2 centuries, and left Bolivia with almost nothing.
Marcus. I filled up my gas tank yesterday, and I'm still emotionally processing the receipt. $48 for a country that has its own oil. Something about that feels fundamentally broken.
That feeling has a name. Economists call it the resource curse, and the most spectacular example of it in human history is sitting in the Bolivian Andes right now, a mountain called Cerro Rico.
Cerro Rico. Rich hill. I'm guessing it didn't stay that way for everyone?
Between 1545 and 1800, that one mountain produced roughly $2 trillion in silver in today's money. It funded the Spanish Armada. It bankrolled the Counter-Reformation. It literally created the dollar sign.
Wait, the dollar sign came from Bolivia?
From a Bolivian mint, yes. And the country that produced all of it is still one of the poorest in the Western Hemisphere. Today, we're opening that ledger. Every ounce extracted, every body it cost, and every peso that never came back.
Let's go.
The year is 1545. A Quechua shepherd named Diego Hualpa is camping on the slopes of a mountain in what is now southern Bolivia. Altitude 15,000 feet, so cold at night that he lights a fire. And the next morning, he notices something extraordinary. Thin silver threads running out of the soil around his fire pit, melted out by the heat.
He literally just camped on a mountain and accidentally discovered the richest silver deposit in history.
That is the story that came down to us anyway. And whether it's perfectly accurate or not, within 3 years of that discovery, more than 14,000 people had relocated to the slopes of what the Spanish immediately named Cerro Rico, Rich Hill. Within 20 years, Potosi was the largest city in the Western Hemisphere. Bigger than London, bigger than Paris.
How is that possible? It's at 13,000 feet elevation in the middle of the Andes. You can't even breathe up there.
You can't grow food either. Everything, every potato, every piece of lumber, every candle had to be carried up the mountain by llama train. But people came anyway because the ore was so rich. The first Spanish assayers calculated that the original ore veins were yielding up to 50% pure silver. 50%. Modern silver mines are profitable at 0.01%.
That's not a mine. That's basically a solid silver mountain with some rock inconveniently mixed in.
Exactly. In the first 2 decades, just the 1550s and 1560s, the Spanish crown extracted what we would value today at roughly $180 billion, and they had barely scratched the surface. The mountain's total output over 250 years works out to approximately 41,000 metric tons of pure silver.
41,000 metric tons. I genuinely have no frame of reference for that number.
Here's one. It was enough silver to build a literal bridge from Potosi to Madrid. That's a real estimate contemporaries made at the time. They also said the devil himself would have built the bridge just to walk across it.
Dark, and probably prophetic.
Very prophetic, because the moment the Spanish realized what they had, the question stopped being, how do we mine this? And became, how do we mine this as fast as possible with the least possible cost? And the answer they came up with was one of the most brutal labor systems in history. To understand the Mita, you have to understand that the Inca Empire already had a labor draft system before the Spanish arrived. Adult men owed the state a certain number of days of labor per year for roads, temples, army service. The Spanish looked at that system and said, perfect, we'll keep it. We'll just redirect it to the mines, and we'll make it permanent.
They literally took an existing labor system and weaponized it.
Weaponized and scaled it. Under Spanish Viceroy Francisco de Toledo in 1573, the Mita was formalized across 16 provinces of what is now Peru and Bolivia. Every adult male between 18 and 50 owed 1 year of labor in the Potosi mines out of every 7 years. The designated workforce at any given time was roughly 13,500 men.
That sounds almost manageable. Like, that doesn't sound like 8 million deaths.
It doesn't until you understand the working conditions. Miners entered the mountain on Monday morning and didn't come out until Saturday night. 6 days underground. They descended ladders, essentially notched logs, carrying candles and their own food, into tunnels that went 750 feet straight down. Temperature inside, over 100 degrees Fahrenheit near the ore faces. Mercury poisoning was endemic because the Spanish used mercury amalgamation to process silver. Silica dust destroyed lungs within a few years. The Spanish themselves called Potosi the mouth of hell.
The average life expectancy once you entered the Mita must have been, what, a few years?
Historical estimates suggest that a Mita worker assigned to the deepest tunnels had a working life of roughly 3 to 4 years before death or total disability. And because the official draft quota was never enough, mine owners supplemented with mangados, nominally free workers who were paid wages. But those wages were set so low and workers were so indebted to company stores that the distinction between free and forced was largely theoretical.
So they ran a debt peonage system on top of the forced labor system. Belt and suspenders of exploitation.
And it worked for over 2 centuries. The total death toll is contested. Estimates range from 4 million to 8 million indigenous and African enslaved workers over the full 250-year operation. The Peruvian priest Antonio de la Calancha wrote in 1638 that every silver peso minted at Potosi had cost the lives of 10 Indians. That's not metaphor. He was doing rough arithmetic.
10 lives per peso. How many pesos did Potosi mint?
Approximately 1 billion pesos de ocho, pieces of 8, over its full operating life. You do that math and you understand why Bolivia's relationship with this history is not academic. It is visceral. It is generational. It is ongoing.
1 billion coins, 8 million people. That is the most horrifying unit conversion I've ever heard.
Here's something that doesn't get taught in American history class. The dollar sign, that deride, almost certainly derives from the pillars of Hercules stamped on Spanish pieces of 8. The S shape threaded through 2 vertical pillars. The United States adopted the dollar in 1785 and they modeled it explicitly on the piece of 8 that was already the dominant currency in colonial America, because there wasn't enough British coinage to go around.
So the symbol of American capitalism has its roots in a Bolivian forced labor death mine. I want to let that sit for a second.
Let it sit. Now let's talk about the machine that made it happen. The Casa de la Moneda, the Mint of Potosi, was built in 1572 and is still standing. It's one of the best preserved colonial buildings in South America. At its peak, it was the largest industrial building in the Americas, employing over 1,000 workers and operating around the clock.
What made Potosi's mint different from any other mint?
Scale and standardization. The piece of 8 was exactly 27.5 grams of silver, 93% pure, and it was accepted without weighing from Seville to Manila to Amsterdam. When the Spanish opened the Manila galleon trade route in 1565, connecting Acapulco to the Philippines, pieces of 8 became the currency of the entire Pacific economy. Chinese merchants in Canton were paying for silk in Potosi silver. Japanese samurai lords were paying their stipends in Potosi silver.
Wait, so a coin minted in Bolivia was the operating currency of China and Japan?
For roughly 200 years, yes. Economists now estimate that between 1500 and 1800, the Americas, primarily Potosi, exported roughly $4 trillion worth of silver in today's terms to Europe and Asia. Of that, Potosi alone accounts for about $2 trillion. It was the world's monetary system, not contributed to, it was the system.
That's not a colonial silver mine. That's the Federal Reserve, but underground and run on slave labor.
That is an uncomfortably accurate description. And here's what makes it a genuine heist rather than just a sad colonial story. The Spanish crown understood perfectly well that it was extracting a finite, non-renewable resource. They had actuaries. They had assay reports. They knew the veins would thin. And rather than investing any portion of the proceeds in Bolivian infrastructure, roads, schools, hospitals, agricultural development, they spent essentially every peso on European wars.
Every single peso.
The Spanish crown's share, the quinto real, the royal fifth, was literally 20% of all silver extracted, paid directly to Madrid. An additional cut went to the Catholic Church. What remained went to private mine owners, most of whom were Spanish or Creole. The indigenous Andean population that produced all of it received wages that were deliberately calibrated to prevent any capital accumulation whatsoever. Let's follow the money. The piece of 8 leaves the mint in Potosi. It travels by Llama train to the coast at Arica. It loads onto galleons that sail north to Panama, cross the isthmus by mule, reload onto Atlantic galleons, and sail to Seville. The entire journey takes about 6 to 9 months, and waiting in Seville are the Genoese and Flemish bankers who have already lent the Spanish crown money against the promise of this exact shipment.
Spain was running deficits against its own silver mine.
Constantly, Spain declared bankruptcy, full sovereign default, 6 times between 1557 and 1647. 6 times. Each time, Potosi silver allowed them to borrow again, spend again, and default again. The historian Henry Kamen calculated that between 1550 and 1650, fully 75% of all Spanish crown revenue from the Americas was immediately pledged to German and Italian banking houses before it even arrived in Spain.
So the silver went from Bolivian miners to Seville bankers to German banks without ever really benefiting Spain?
Spain got the wars. The Fugger banking family of Augsburg got the profits. Philip II spent Potosi silver to build the Armada, 130 ships, roughly $2.8 billion in today's money, against England in 1588. He spent it fighting the Dutch Revolt for 80 years, a conflict that cost the equivalent of $600 billion in modern terms, and which Spain ultimately lost. He spent it on the Battle of Lepanto against the Ottomans in 1571. He built the Escorial Palace, $14 billion in today's dollars, as a monument to God's favor.
And then lost the Armada. God's favor, really delivering.
Here's the extraordinary paradox at the heart of this whole story. The more silver Spain extracted, the poorer Spain became. Economists call it the price revolution. When $2 trillion worth of silver floods into a European economy in 150 years, you get catastrophic inflation. Spanish prices rose roughly 500% between 1500 and 1650. Spanish manufacturers couldn't compete with cheaper Dutch and English goods. Spain became a country that owned a river of silver and bought everything from neighbors who were getting rich, making the things Spain's silver paid for.
So Spain was like a country that discovers oil, spends all of it on imports and wars, and ends up poorer than its manufacturing neighbors. It's the resource curse running in real time.
In real time, over 150 years. And the economist John Maynard Keynes essentially said this about Spain, that they had the wealth and didn't know how to use it. The Dutch and English, who got Spain's silver as payment for goods and services, used it as capital. They built banks. They built joint stock companies. They built the institutions of modern capitalism on Potosi's silver that they didn't mine. Now let's look at the other side of the ledger, what Bolivia actually got. And I want to be precise because the Spanish were quite proud of certain investments they made. They built the city of Potosi. At its peak in 1650, it had a population of around 160,000 people, making it roughly the size of London at the time. There were 36 churches, there were theaters, there was a university.
So there was investment in the region.
In the colonial city, yes, for Spanish and Creole colonists. The indigenous Andean communities that provided the labor received essentially none of it. There was no road network built to facilitate local trade. There was no investment in agriculture to feed the local population. Everything in Potosi was imported at monopoly prices set by Spanish merchants, creating a captive consumer market rather than a local economy.
So the 160,000-person city was basically a company town. A massive, cathedral-studded company town, but still a company town.
Exactly, and here's the number that I keep coming back to. The economic historian Angus Maddison estimated that Bolivia's GDP per capita in 1820, roughly the end of the colonial period, was approximately $672 in 1990 dollars, basically unchanged from pre-conquest levels. 250 years of the world's most productive mine, and the host country's economic output per person hadn't moved.
That is, I mean, that's almost scientifically remarkable. How do you extract $2 trillion and leave zero economic development?
You do it by design. Every structural mechanism was pointed in one direction, outward. The Mita ensured there was no local wage growth. Monopoly merchant guilds ensured there was no local manufacturing. Restrictions on colonial trade, Bolivia could legally only trade with Spain through specific ports at prices set in Madrid, ensured there was no diversification. Eduardo Galeano, the Uruguayan writer, captured it perfectly in 1971. He said that Potosi was born as a curse and grew up as a curse, and the poverty of Bolivia is the underside of the wealth of Europe. The words are poetic. The accounting is accurate.
Galeano was writing Open Veins of Latin America in 1971, and he was basically describing a 400-year-old crime scene that was still active.
Still active because the legal and economic structures built for extraction never got replaced with structures built for development. Bolivia entered independence in 1825 with no banking system, no manufacturing base, no technical education system, no domestic market. Its only inherited institution was a mint that made money for other people. The starting line for the independent nation was set 250 years in the past, and it was set in the wrong direction. By the mid-1700s, the richest veins at Cerro Rico were essentially gone. The mountain had been hollowed out to the point where the internal structure was becoming unstable. It's still dangerously hollow today, and UNESCO has been warning for years that it could collapse. Silver output had fallen from its peak of roughly $120 million per year in the 1590s to about $12 million per year by the 1780s, a 90% drop.
What happens to a city of 160,000 people when the mine it's built around produces 90% less?
It hemorrhages. By 1825, Potosi's population had crashed to around 8,000 people. In 175 years, a city that was the size of London had collapsed to the size of a small town. The churches were stripped of their silver ornaments to pay debts. The mint still operated, but at a fraction of capacity. The Mita was legally abolished in 1812, but the economy it had sustained had already disappeared.
And nobody, not Spain, not the new Bolivian government, nobody stepped in with any kind of transition plan.
There was no mechanism for a transition plan. Spain's interest in Bolivia was always and entirely extractive. When the extraction became uneconomical, Spain's interest ended. The new Bolivian state inherited a depleted mountain, a collapsed city, an uneducated workforce, no banking infrastructure, and external debts it had not incurred. It's the colonial equivalent of a company stripping all the assets from a subsidiary, declaring bankruptcy, and leaving the workers holding the pension obligations.
That's not a metaphor, is it? That's literally what happened.
Literally what happened. Bolivia's first century of independence was characterized by political instability, coups, and economic stagnation that historians directly trace to this inheritance. The country then discovered nitrates in its coastal region and lost that territory to Chile in the War of the Pacific in 1884, landlocking itself permanently. Then it discovered tin in the same Cerro Rico complex and ran essentially the same extractive economic model through the late 19th and early 20th centuries, this time with British mining companies in the roles Spain had previously occupied.
So the pattern didn't just repeat. It repeated with different foreign owners?
Different owners, same ledger. Bolivia has been resource-rich and capital-poor for nearly 5 centuries. And the reason it matters is not just historical. It is the exact reason that Bolivia's lithium deposits are the most politically charged resource story on the planet right now. I want to put a single number on the table and just let it breathe for a moment. The total silver extracted from Cerro Rico between 1545 and 1800 is valued at approximately $2 trillion in 2024 dollars. Bolivia's current GDP is roughly $45 billion per year. That means the mountain produced the equivalent of about 44 years of Bolivia's entire modern economy, and Bolivia got functionally none of it.
Hold on. They extracted $2 trillion, left nothing, hollowed out the mountain so badly it might actually physically collapse. and now tourists pay to go inside it. The Casa de la Moneda charges an entry fee. The Potosi mines run guided tours for adventure travelers. The crime scene is the product.
$25 a ticket for the mine tours. The Casa de la Moneda generates roughly $3 million a year in tourism revenue. In the context of $2 trillion extracted, that is so close to zero, it's almost a joke.
So the entire 500-year legacy of the greatest silver extraction in human history is currently monetized at $3 million a year in museum tickets.
But here's why this pivot moment matters. Because when you lay it out that clearly, $2 trillion out, $3 million back in, you understand why Bolivia's political discourse for the last 30 years has been dominated by one question. How do we make sure this never happens again? How do we sit on top of the world's most valuable resource deposit and actually capture the value this time?
And right now, that question has a very specific answer. Because the most valuable resource in the world in 2024 isn't silver, it's lithium.
Bolivia has an estimated 21 million metric tons of lithium reserves, more than any other country on Earth, in the Salar de Uyuni salt flats, about 200 miles from Potosi. The irony of the geography is almost too much to bear.
200 miles from the mountain that funded the Spanish Empire, there is now the raw material for the electric vehicle revolution. And every Bolivian politician alive knows exactly what happened the last time.
Exactly what happened the last time. Which is why the lithium debate in Bolivia is not just an economics debate. It is a history debate. It is a reparations debate. It is a question about whether a country can rewrite a 500-year pattern in a single generation. In 2008, Bolivian President Evo Morales stood in front of the Salar de Uyuni and said something that made the heads of every lithium company in the world snap up. The lithium belongs to Bolivia. We will not repeat Potosi. He then nationalized the entire lithium sector and established the state company YLB, Yacimientos de Litio Bolivianos, to control extraction, processing, and export.
So this is basically what happens when a country has a 500-year grudge and also happens to sit on the mineral that powers every Tesla on Earth.
And it created a genuine policy dilemma that does not have an easy answer. The orthodox economic position, which the IMF and most Western governments pushed, was that Bolivia should partner with large multinational mining companies who have the capital and technical expertise to extract lithium at scale. Bolivia would get royalties and taxes. The companies would get the margin.
Which is basically the exact same deal Spain offered in 1545. We'll extract it, you get a percentage.
Morales and his successor Arce said, no, we've seen that movie. Instead, Bolivia tried to build its own lithium processing capacity from scratch, including a pilot plant to produce battery-grade lithium carbonate, with an investment of roughly $900 million. The goal was to capture not just raw material revenue, but manufacturing value added.
How's that going?
Slowly and expensively. The state-run extraction model has been criticized for moving too slowly to capture the 2018-2022 lithium price boom when lithium carbonate hit $80,000 per metric ton. Bolivia produced only about 400 metric tons of lithium in 2022, compared to Australia's 61,000. The country's lithium deposits are also technically harder to extract than competitors. The brine chemistry is more complex. The altitude makes processing difficult.
So the ghost of Potosi is pushing Bolivia toward a model that protects sovereignty, but might mean missing the window to cash in while lithium is actually valuable.
That is the precise tension, and it mirrors debates happening in Congo over cobalt, in Chile over copper, in Indonesia over nickel. Everywhere that the raw materials of the green energy transition are concentrated in countries that experience colonial resource extraction. The question is, can you have sovereignty and speed? Can you capture manufacturing value and move fast enough to compete?
That's not just Bolivia's question. That's the central economic question of the 21st century for the entire global South.
And Potosi is not just background context for that question. It is the reason the question is so charged. Bolivia doesn't have an economics problem with lithium. it has a trauma problem, and those require different solutions. I want to end the history with one specific data point because I think it captures the full weight of what we've been discussing. In 2005, Bolivia's GDP per capita was approximately $1,010. In 2014, at the peak of the commodity boom under Morales' nationalization policies, nationalized gas, nationalized minerals, it had reached $3,100, a tripling in 9 years. Poverty dropped from 60% to 35%.
Okay, that's actually remarkable. That's a real comeback story.
It is a real improvement. And then the commodity cycle turned. Lithium prices crashed in 2023, down from $80,000 per metric ton to around $13,000 per metric ton in 18 months. Bolivia's fiscal position deteriorated sharply. Foreign exchange reserves dropped from $15 billion in 2014 to roughly $1.7 billion by 2023. The country is once again in economic difficulty.
So the same vulnerability that made Potosi catastrophic, total dependence on the price of one resource you don't control, is still the vulnerability.
That is the original sin of the Potosi model, and it was never fully broken. The Spanish created a monoculture, not just in the Potosi region, but across the entire Bolivian economy. 5 centuries later, Bolivia is still a commodity-dependent economy where the government's fiscal health tracks directly with global mineral prices. The structural problem that Eduardo Galeano diagnosed in 1971 is still the structural problem today.
The heist is over, but the poverty it created is still running.
And here's the thing that I find genuinely heartbreaking about this history. The $2 trillion isn't just a number about colonial injustice, it's a number about compound interest. That capital, if it had been invested locally, in education, in agriculture, in infrastructure, starting in 1600 would have compounded for 400 years. We cannot calculate what Bolivia would look like if that had happened. But we know what South Korea and Singapore did with far less capital and far fewer natural resources in a quarter of the time. That's the counterfactual that haunts this history.
The cruelest part of a heist isn't just what they took. It's what you could have built with it.
That is the autopsy finding. Not just death, opportunity cost. The $2 trillion is the headline. The $20 trillion in foregone development is the real number, and nobody in the historical record ever had to account for it. All right, we've done the autopsy. Here's the question I want to leave in your head.
Was Potosi the world's greatest corporate heist, a deliberate, architecturally designed extraction of wealth from a people who never consented? Or just the resource curse, a structural trap that any empire in that position would have fallen into the same way?
Put your verdict in the comments. Was this unique evil or just the inevitable logic of colonial capitalism?
And the open question, for everyone. Bolivia has 21 million metric tons of lithium and 500 years of reasons not to trust foreign companies. If you were the finance minister, what would you do? Partner up and move fast, or go slow and keep control? Tell us below.
We read every comment, genuinely.
Speaking of what comes next,
Next episode, we're heading to West Africa. In 1482, the Portuguese built a castle on the coast of what is now Ghana, Elmina Castle, specifically to process gold and then human beings. The Gold Coast produced so much gold it literally renamed European currencies. We're opening those books next time.
see you then.